right. While some people are still coming in, we can get going and I will start providing a bit of context for this. So first of all, thank you very much for joining today's webinar hosted by Carbonfuture on how governments can ensure trust and transparency in carbon removal. Before I move forward, maybe first, why this title, why this webinar right now? As you know, carbon removal is something that happens very often far away from people's homes. Many people might not interface with day to day, and we're taking this invisible gas and trying to store it away for millennia. Now, to do this and to be able to do this at scale, we will need to make sure that what we're doing is actually working. And how do we do that? By building the right policies, but also the right infrastructure to ensure that. And this is what this webinar today is really about, is how exactly are we doing that? Where do we stand today and what's coming up? I'm joined by some incredible speakers today. I think actually most of them will not need any introduction to a lot of the attendees, but I'll quickly remind you who they are. They're definitely the people who I would want on a webinar when it comes to exactly this topic. So I'm very grateful they're here. Thank you for joining us today. And today we're joined by myself. I'm the moderator, Sebastian Mannert. I lead policy at Carbonfuture. Then we've got Noah Deitsch, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Carbon Management, and I guess one of the veterans of carbon removal. I personally know very few people who've been in it as long as Noah has. So always pleased to have him in the discussion. We've got Anu Khan, the founder and executive director of the Carbon Removal Standards Initiative, a very recent organization that has been launched to focus pretty much exactly on the topic we're discussing today. So I'm very glad to have her here. We've got Fabian Ramos, the carbon removals lead at the European Commission, who probably until just a few days ago was very busy setting up the next stage of the CSCF, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, and has been one of the leading figures on carbon removal policy in Europe. And then we've got Rodica Avonik, who is the Associate Policy Director at Carbon Gap. And as you might know, with Carbon Gap, she's been doing some leading work on shaping European, in particular, carbon removal policy. You'll hear from all of them in a second. They're going to give, just so you know the agenda, they're going to give very short, kind of 3-minute inputs just to set the stage, each of them. Then we're going to have a discussion based on all the wonderful questions that you submitted in advance. So thank you very much for those who registered and submitted both kind of what they would like to learn and the questions. We reviewed them together as speakers. And then we essentially decided what we should talk about to cover most ground that you found interesting or want to talk about. And then after that, we will have a Q&A with questions that are coming from the audience. Feel free to keep them coming. We will only address them in the last third of the conversation. But if you do want, even as something comes up, as some of the speakers already provide input at the beginning, feel free to put it into the Q&A of the Zoom meeting. Now, before moving to these inputs, I'll quickly give a bit of background on what we mean with trust infrastructure and a bit more about this policy panel today. So CDR policy, why now? We've got elections all around the world. I mean, everyone's kind of eagerly waiting for what's going to happen next Tuesday in the US. But obviously, we've already had elections in Europe, in France, in a lot of countries around the world. At the same time, we're seeing the policy landscape evolving. The CSCF, or the Carbon Removal and Carbon Farming Regulation in Europe, which is kind of a landmark legislation, which we're going to hear more about, but also the implementation of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, Noah's team has been very busy trying to see how you can essentially implement this groundbreaking green transition legislation that was passed a while back in the US. And we're seeing both regional, but also national kind of policy leadership from countries like Denmark, states like California, and investment keeps pouring into CDR technologies. Every week, there seems to be another big fundraise, despite the tough conditions in the market. And so a lot of momentum is building. Questions still to be answered. I would say it's many more than two, but we kind of pick two just to kind of set the stage a little bit. Obviously, compliance markets. Once we start moving from voluntary markets into compliance markets, we need to make sure that what is being integrated into these compliance markets is rock solid. And this is where a lot of what we talk about today will come into play. And second, the role of independent DMRV, which I'll explain in a second. Next slide. So what is MRV? It's a buzzword that means a million different things to a million different people. And I'm sure Anu, more than anyone, will probably encounter this when she speaks to people. But it is basically, it's monitoring, transparent reporting, and independent verification. Imagine for the whole process of carbon removal, we need to have a robust data trail that allows us to track every single step of that process and allows us to essentially prove that a ton has actually been removed and locked away for good. That's what MRV does. Next slide. And we're trying to solve two problems. The first one is an efficiency problem. Doing this data trail is currently really, really inefficient in many cases. It involves the creation and uploading of a lot of documents, pictures, text, all sorts of things that can take a lot of effort to do. And this needs to be digitized, it needs to be automated, it needs to be connected to sensors. We need to become more efficient at doing it if we are to scale it. And the second problem is a trust problem, which is essentially how do we make sure that we remove the ability for any bad actor, or at times even somebody who is not necessarily a bad actor but just makes a mistake, how do we remove that space for those errors in that chain so that we end up with a trustworthy data trail? Next slide, please. At Carbonfuture, we focus exactly on this. We kind of create these MRV end-to-end products. And we've done this initially for biochar. We're developing them as well for other durable CDR technologies. And we layer on top of the MRV also services such as working with suppliers directly to get them off the ground, due diligence on suppliers, and the whole tracking itself. If you're interested in it, if you're a supplier or buyer, make sure to get in touch with us. But yeah, basically MRV is our bread and butter. And at this point, let's dive into the inputs. We will start with Anu, if that's okay with you, just to kind of get your take on to open us up today. Over to you, Anu.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Thank you for inviting me to participate. As many of you know, I'm obsessed with the topic of trust, transparency, and accountability in CDR. So really happy to participate in this conversation. For those of you who might not know me, my name is Anu Khan, and I lead a new nonprofit called the Carbon Removal Standards Initiative. Our mission is to provide technical assistance and capacity building to NGOs and policymakers on carbon quantification. Our work is predicated on three fundamental realizations. First, carbon removal is a public good. Carbon removed anywhere is carbon removed everywhere. And we do this fundamentally to reduce the harm from climate change. So that's kind of why we do carbon removal. The second realization is that carbon removal supply and demand will be largely policy driven. We're already seeing this today with the voluntary carbon market looking to policy and inviting Noah and Fabian to speak everywhere all the time to tell us like what is good enough and what should we be doing. And so that's only going to become more salient in the future, that supply and demand will be policy driven. And the third realization is that carbon removal is not one thing. There are removal solutions embedded in every major industry in the world today and some new industries that we're in the process of building. So I think taken together, this means that folks with very different backgrounds and expertise will interact with and often be responsible for writing the rules for carbon removal. And we believe at CERSI that civil society, academics, NGOs, multilateral institutions can help provide financially unconflicted advice and input to this process of rulemaking and industry integration. And that's going to help us build a more robust, transparent, and equitable CDR ecosystem. And one key message that I want to keep focusing on throughout this conversation is that governments will not only support MRV for carbon crediting projects, governments will play a bigger and broader role in quality infrastructure across industries for all types of carbon quantification. And I'm excited to dive into what that could look like throughout this conversation.
Thank you, Arno. And yeah, some very nice catchy phrases as well that I'm sure everyone can remember from that. So yeah, and I do realize that especially lately, Fabian and Noah, you've been basically on the road together in a lot of these events together. You can kind of come as a package these days, but you also, yeah, I think you add a lot of value to these conversations. And with that, Noah, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Sebastian. First and foremost, thank you for welcoming me to this webinar. I think it's great. I never get tired of talking to friends here about MRV because it's really important. I'm actually in Silicon Valley right now at a clean tech conference. And one of the things that I think is really salient about being here in the heart of so much of the clean tech innovation in the US is the reminder that technology and products are not necessarily the same thing. If you have the best carbon removal technology in the world, it could be super cheap, super scalable, but you do not have good MRV, nobody's going to pay you to actually develop that solution. And so I think it's often thought of as separate from carbon removal. How do we get the technology innovation? How do we do the MRV? But it really is, if we want to think about developing the industry, a package, and that is the product. The business case, regardless of whether it's government or private industry, requires really strong MRV. And so I think we often think about all this innovation that's happening in the US, the great work that Fabian and his colleagues are doing on regulatory standards, but they're really inseparable. It is different sides of the same coin. And I think it's really important that we think about innovation as not just the technology piece, but the MRV, because I think there's a huge opportunity if we get both of those things right. We're going to need to clean up on the order of 1 trillion tons of carbon by the end of the century in order to meet our climate goals, which sounds like a really daunting number, but it's one that I think presents massive opportunities for communities across the US and around the world to participate in a net zero and then net negative economy of the future in a way that creates high quality jobs, can be aligned with environmental sustainability. And all of that is really predicated on getting the measurement, reporting, and verification right. And so I think it's just absolutely critical that we think about those two things in parallel and make sure that the industry can evolve in lockstep with the technology and the MRV into one cohesive package.
Really, really interesting points. And I really like this differentiation between kind of the technology and the product involving the MRV as well. And it may be something that we can also drop in the notes here, because I saw it like last week, the Grantham Institute released this report on the cost of MRV. And that was really, really interesting to see just how large that can be for some CDR technologies. But that's the point, right? Like if you want to get the product right, at the moment, you have to overinvest in many cases in MRV. But yeah, maybe we can link that in the notes. Fabian, over to you.
Better like that. Thank you, Sebastian. And I'm also very happy to be here today to have this discussion with Noah, with Anu, with Rodica. It's really nice. And this is really a topic that, as you know, is essential for us at the Commission, for us at the DG Klima. When, let's say, 5 years ago or 6 years ago, we started to look at carbon removals in the context of the long-term objective of the European Union, we immediately understood that if we wanted to have the trust of the citizen, we needed to develop a framework to ensure that whatever we do with carbon removal, we have the quantification right, we have the sustainability aspect in place, and everything there. This is an experience also we have learned, not necessarily from the carbon removal perspective, but also from the emissions perspective. You know that in Europe we have the ETS, and already within the ETS we had very strong requirement in terms of monitoring, reporting, and verification. I don't know if many of you know, but all the 11,000 installations that are under the ETS, they get annual audit. So every year, obviously, where there is a checking of all the emission data that they are reporting. So when we develop the CSCF, we want to build on the existing infrastructure we have in Europe already. And we also want to use what we are going to do under the CSCF to improve also the reporting of all the policies. I'm thinking in particular on the LULUCF, everything related to the emission and absorption of CO2 by the land. CSCF is not only about permanent carbon removal, it's also about carbon farming. And today in Europe, we have policies for activities that are under carbon farming, meaning agriculture and forestry. And we think that we could also improve the monitoring, reporting, and verification under this activity, improve in different perspective, improve in terms of quality, of course. There is a lot of uncertainty on the reporting under this, and also improve in terms of cost, in terms of making it easier for getting the data. And we are in particular thinking about everything that you can do in terms of satellite imaging, remote sensing, and this kind of thing. This is something we are looking at very closely for everything related to carbon farming. And for permanent removal also, of course, we have in Europe the CCS directive. We want to build on it, the ETS monitoring, I already mentioned it. We have everything related to biomass policies, because for me, monitoring and reporting is not only about the CO2, so about the emissions or absorption of CO2, but it's also about anything related to the activities that help you to do this carbon removal. And if you are using biomass, it's important to know from where the biomass is coming and what type of biomass is used, and to have an accurate reporting on that. So all that to say that there is many links to the MRV, and I'm very happy to discuss it today.
Yeah, and I think especially last week at the CSCF workshop, I think the whole topic of biomass sustainability was huge, right? And so it links exactly to what you said. And it's music to my ears to hear that you're going to look more also in kind of Internet of Things and sensors, because that has so much potential, not just for carbon farming, but also for all other durable carbon removal pathways, right? So I think we're just scratching the surface of what's possible there. Last but not least, Radhika, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really a pleasure to be here with everyone today, and thank you for inviting me. So yeah, I'm Radhika. I'm co-leading the EU policy team at Carbon Gap. We are an NGO that was set up fairly recently, and I don't know until when I will keep saying that. Maybe after 5 years, it will be, oh, we've been around for a longer time. But we've been around only for 3 years, and in many ways, we started with the CRCF, truly. That was the main thing that we focused on 3 years ago, and we've followed the developments closely at the co-legislation level, but also now at the technical level, the expert group level. And yeah, as Sebastian, you said, it's really a landmark initiative that the EU is putting there, and it's very, very important. And we're really happy to be able to contribute. And at Carbon Gap, aside from doing that, and our science team is very much focused and busy with now the draft methodologies. We're also thinking about long-term other type of policies that are needed in Europe to make sure that we scale CDR to the level that we will need to reach our climate goals. And there, you know, we're thinking about the climate law next year and potential separate targets ideally. And, you know, as Fabian was saying, questions around ETS integration or the need potentially for a separate trading system that is dedicated to removals. Overall, quite busy and during very exciting times, so I'm by no means complaining. And I guess going to zooming into the topic of today, and what would be my key message aside from everything that was said is truly that we need to focus when we're speaking about MRV and certification, how crucial it is, especially when it comes to the uses of the credits and how exactly are we going to use these credits and for what. So there, making sure that the MRV and the framework in general is very robust, is very strong, will really provide transparency and accountability, and in a way will help us regain trust, if I may say that, in climate claims, and to say that there's a lack of trust or skepticism around making climate claims is an understatement. And the good thing in a way is that the EU, aside from working on the CRCF, is also working on a parallel legislation called green claims that will deal specifically with that. And as Carbon Gap, we believe that companies who are advanced and who are sort of taking action to contribute to climate goals in general should be able to claim certain things, but follow really strict rules that right now at the EU level, you know, all the 3 institutions are setting in place. And then, of course, you know, we need to take into account the fact that at some point we will talk about compliance. You know, we will talk about incorporating novel CDR into national inventories to make sure that, you know, these types of methods count towards countries' climate goals. So overall, not an easy task. And again, you know, to the credit of the Commission, a lot of important strides have been made at the expert group level, and we have some drafts of the methodologies. But also to your point, Sebastian, there's a lot of questions, and last week was a testament to that. So there's still questions, as you said, around biomass, around many other things. And we admire and we support the ambition of the Commission to come up with something really quickly. And from what we understand, you know, draft methodology, the draft delegated acts could be out there already as soon as the beginning of next year. But from our perspective, it's important to do things not as fast as possible in this sense, but as best as possible. And it's very important to address some of the concerns that still remain. So yeah, that would be my general message to start with.
Thank you, Radhika. And I'm realizing two things. So first, I think a lot of acronyms or kind of policies are being thrown around here: green claims, ETS, CSCF. And maybe again to my Carbonfuture colleagues, I know we've written kind of articles on all of these three, for example. Maybe we can link them in the chat so people can read up on them while we speak if they want to. And the second thing is, as per what Radhika just said, obviously we do have to build up trust, right? Like we have not spoken about this yet, but there's obviously the whole baggage of the voluntary carbon market and some of the trust issues that market has faced in the last years. And we're trying to build a better market here through good policy. And at this point, maybe we're going to move to the questions. And one of the themes that came up a lot in the people who registered was, which is great, is basically the private sector's role in developing these policies. I take that as a positive because it means I'm seeing more and more people want to get involved. 2 years ago, it was not as much the case, but now you have a lot of actors who want to get involved and who are asking, what are the opportunities for the private sector? What's the role of the private sector right now to be involved? And so, yeah, maybe if you want to start, Noah, just like, how do you see the role of the private sector? And then later, I'd love to hear how that might be different in Europe, for example, from Fabien.
Yeah, happy to. So a few months ago, the Biden administration released a set of principles on high integrity voluntary carbon markets, basically acknowledging exactly what you said. The whole voluntary carbon market space has a really checkered past, but we see an enormous opportunity for these voluntary markets done well to drive climate finance into projects that otherwise wouldn't get them. And I think we've seen a major shift in the voluntary carbon market, where historically the market has been incredibly low priced. The willingness to pay has been very low. And so what we've seen in many ways, in some cases, is a race to the bottom. What's the cheapest possible credit that you can get? And as a result, we've seen a lot of credits that have cut corners on MRV and ended up over crediting, basically claiming that they've done things that they didn't actually do. The carbon removal space seems to have corrected entirely in the opposite direction, where there are folks now willing to pay hundreds of dollars a ton for high integrity carbon removal credits. They're obviously not buying the same volumes at these higher prices, but we see small and growing voluntary credit purchases at that really high price as being really, really important to not just develop the technology, but to make sure that we develop the MRV systems that can avoid many of the issues that happened in the past. And we think that this willingness to pay is really, really important. The fact that companies have figured out how to take the same overall spend, but shift away from some of the low priced and potentially lower quality offsets into these high integrity carbon removal credits is something that I think everyone can be doing today. The US government has started buying carbon removal credits through a pilot program. We just released a primer on how other organizations can do the same. And we've seen dozens of businesses, some of the big tech companies, Microsoft, the Frontier Coalition, which includes groups like Google, Meta recently joined us. So I think there's just a huge amount of opportunity today. And it's one where I think folks don't need to be afraid of spending a high price. And even buying just a very small volume, that is incredibly meaningful today. And I think correcting towards the let's make sure that we're effectively undercrediting, avoiding any situation in which we're claiming that we're doing something that we're not, really protects the field and enables to develop. And over time, we'll be able to claim larger and larger fractions of what actually happens with greater confidence. But we really see the impetus now is that demand piece. How do we unlock all of the excitement that we see around these solutions, and really the demand for that high integrity product is really critical now.
Thanks for that, Noah. And yeah, Fabian, do you want to know that this was like a great American perspective of how the private sector can be catalyzed, I guess, with your own purchase price and get moving. What's the role of the private sector as you develop CDR policy in Europe? You're on mute, Fabian.
Yeah, I'm sure next time I will get it right from the beginning. Yeah, no, of course, very important to work together with the private sector, because basically the private sector, in terms of carbon removal, this is they have the knowledge. So we need to build on the knowledge that has been accumulated over the previous year when we talk about putting in place a certification methodology for carbon removal. And that's why in Europe, we decided right away to build, to put in place this expert group on carbon removal. So for those that are not very familiar with this expert group, the Commission, just after the publication of the proposal for certification for carbon removal 2 years ago, decided to set up an expert group on carbon removal that put together experts, not only European experts. Actually, we have few experts also coming from US and from other parts of the world on carbon removal. So by expert, we mean the stakeholders with a different level of technical expertise, but also stakeholders are very much involved in the business of carbon removal. And why we decided to do like that is because we really wanted to put in place methodology for the certification that work for everybody. Methodology that will bring trust, as we say already many times, is very important. And it was very important the civil society was present in this expert group. Methodology also that can work for project developers, because sometimes when we develop some aspect of a methodology, we do not have in mind some very specific technical aspects that project developers know better than everyone on that. And this is why we also had to invite them. Last week in our discussion on the methodology, for instance, for bioenergy and CCS, we had some BECS project developers that explain us how they optimize between different units. Just to give an example, the use of biomass and use the biomass in the most efficient unit. And this is typically the kind of things that we didn't really have in mind when we started to propose some element of quantification and the limitation of using additional biomass for BECS. So just to give you an idea that all these inputs are very important, and we are very happy to have this expert group. Then another aspect, it's the link between the certification that we are establishing in Europe and existing schemes for the certification or programs from the voluntary carbon market. The legal act for the certification of carbon removal is very clear, is building on existing scheme to do the certification. It's not that the European Commission has created a new agency that is going to issue carbon removal. No, the issuance of carbon removal will be done by a scheme that will be recognized by the Commission. So just to say that we need, of course, we need them. We need the experience of all these programs accumulated over the time from the CDM perspective, but also after that. We are building on what they know to do. Sorry, and they are very important in the process of the certification. So we need really to have a continuous discussion with the private sector, with project developer on carbon removal. So it's all the technical discussions that are happening at the level of expert group. And we need also the help of private schemes that are doing a robust quantification of carbon removal to do the issuance of the carbon removal unit that we'll get at the end.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I just wanted to jump in on here around the private sector, again, coming from the US perspective, because as you all know, we love to support the private sector. One thing that Noah mentioned is that we've been seeing this shift to price and quality in the VCM recently that's been really catalytic. And I think one of the things I'm most excited about in that early buying is it's an incentive to innovate in low margin industries and identify things that look like reductions and removals that we otherwise might not have found, because these industries on their own are not necessarily looking for innovative new ways to remove carbon. They're providing a commodity product at the lowest possible cost. They're sort of running on rails. And what we're seeing some of these really exciting new buyers do is catalyze and provide an incentive to innovate and find removals that we otherwise might not have found. And I think that's really, really important because I don't think we know all of the carbon removal solutions yet. We're still in this early stage. There's some that are further along and we're getting closer to commercial deployment, and that's fantastic. But I think there's probably more opportunities. And I see this as one of the really powerful ways that private sector is going to inform policy, because we need to find the removal opportunities and solutions before we can bring to bear a more robust suite of policies to support that solution.
Yeah, and if I may really quickly, just following up on Fabian, and again with the EU sort of mindset, I just wanted to really appreciate the effort of the Commission in truly ensuring that there is an inclusive approach to the way they design policy. And this expert group, and it's not only private sector and that CDR providers, buyers, and so on, but it's a wider group of stakeholders. It includes academics, it includes the NGO community, it includes anyone that is really interested and has sort of something to say and is actively thinking about carbon removal. So that is truly, I would say, the absolute advantage of the way that the Commission is approaching the issue. And yeah, to Anna's point, as we go forward, and the Commission will, I mean, right now we're focusing, for instance, on bio-CCS, DAX, and biochar, for instance, but at some point we will need to move on to new technologies and so on. So we need to make sure that the expert group is sort of open also to, a representative of other type of technologies that are not yet represented in the expert group. That would be the one thing I'd add. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Now to kind of shift us back a little bit into MRV territory, and Anuel, ask you here. We've spoken a lot about why it's important. We've had, I think, really good insights into how it's currently viewed by policy, but how do we operationalize MRV? Like, how do we actually make it work? What are the pieces that potentially need to be strengthened to make it work?
Yeah, so I think of MRV as you mentioned, there's a lot of different ways you can cut the sort of broader challenge of MRV, but I think of it as essentially 4 main pieces. MRV is standards or rules, like this is what we say we're going to do. Then it is tools to actually collect data or quantify against those rules. So I would include sensors, models, this whole suite of tools in that category. The third thing is data and data management infrastructure. So you have some rules, you have some ways of collecting data, you need to put that data somewhere and analyze it. And then the fourth piece is liability and enforcement. So you collect your data, you check against your rules, and there has to be some sort of consequence for either meeting or not meeting those rules. Either you get paid because you did the thing you were supposed to do, or you get dinged somehow for not doing it. And to be honest, I think we probably need work on all of those fronts. Obviously, I spend most of my time on the standards development piece, and we've talked about that quite a bit so far, but we still need additional work on the sort of tools category of sensors and models and how do we actually quantify. I think we're seeing a lot of innovation in this space, and we're seeing that innovation also be supported by policy. So for example, in the US, there's the ARPA-E CO2 program, that's sensor development for marine CDR. We're seeing a lot of innovation in models as well with organizations like Seaworthy that are focused in that space. So we're seeing innovation around MRV tools, but there's certainly more to do. And some of that is also fundamental research. The data management piece, I think, again, we're seeing activity and there's a lot to do. I think a really cool new activity in this space is Cascade's data quarry that I think came out earlier this week. So there are nonprofit, civil society, and also government efforts to really wrap our heads around this data management challenge. But again, work to do. I don't know anyone who's saying like, we know exactly where the data goes and what this format is. But I think really the crux of this problem on around MRV is going to be enforcement and liability. It's going to be what happens when you don't do what you say you're going to do. If you make a claim and that claim is false, what happens? And I think Fabian and Rodica have spoken to this already, that there's growing policy work in this space as well. If you make a claim and that claim is not accurate, there's some enforcement mechanism.
Maybe this links very well to something that I wanted to ask Fabian, which is, you described this, I mean, Anna, you just described kind of MRV is a lot of different steps, right? And there's actually also beautiful visualization that, again, the Grantham Institute today brought out with Allied Offset of kind of all these different branches that it takes and the different levels. So I recommend looking at that. But Fabian, when you think about kind of policy from the EU level, the CSCF, I know a big discussion over the last year that has definitely been a big discussion within the private sector of CDR has been, at what level will the European Commission want to operate when it comes to MRV? So given this whole that it involves such a broad spectrum, where do you think government is best placed, and where should government potentially leave it to the private sector? You are muted.
You didn't notice it. I'm going to reply first to Anu's point on how to enforce. Even if you develop the best MRV framework possible, if you don't have a way to take action in case of fraud, to enforce the method, the process and the legislation that you put in place. Well, the legislation in the case of Europe, but we don't have to have a legislation on carbon removal everywhere in the world. Then you have an issue, and it's something very important. And as I said, in Europe we are in a particular situation where we're doing a lot of legislation in Europe. We're legislating on many different aspects. We have something for the renewable energy. We have something on the sustainability of biomass. We have something on the storage of the CO2 in geological side. This is what we call the CCS directive. We have everything related to the transport of CO2 that is done through under the ETS directive, etc. So we have a lot of pieces of legislation a bit everywhere that we can use in the context of the CSCF. And if there are mistakes made during the activity of a carbon removal provider, it has to be reported, and action can be taken. And depending on what kind of, if it's a voluntary mistake or not a voluntary mistake, there is always a time where you can try to fix it. But if you continue in your mistake in a voluntary manner, there is always some clause specifying with what kind of action and the liability aspect that are very important. And this is something for the CSCF that is a key aspect. Now to come back to your question, Sebastian, it's not always very simple to see exactly where is the limit between what we have to propose at the level of the Commission, at the level of national governments in Europe or outside Europe, and how much flexibility we give to the private sector to implement the key requirement that we want to set. For the CSCF, we have legislation that is the general framework, where is basically it's a very it's not detailed at all, and it's key principles that are absolutely necessary. And if I want to summarize it, I would say the CSCF general framework is saying quantification has to be good. You have to be sure that when you say it's permanent, and you need to take care of the sustainability aspects, not only climate aspect, but also environmental sustainability. So do not harm principle and additionality aspect. And it does not go beyond that. And now the question is, when we develop the methodology to implement these principles, how far do we need to go into the details? With the first draft of the methodology that we provided recently, I will not say that it's a fully comprehensive approach, but there is a certain amount of details. We give some, for instance, we give some information about, or we put some requirement in terms of what kind of source, of course, of CO2 you have to look at when you do the life cycle assessment of your carbon removal activities. We do a lot of links with existing framework, existing legislation. I mentioned already ETS, CCS, etc. But we cannot go. We do not have the knowledge, and I think it will not be useful to be too much perspective on every single point related to carbon removal activities. And because we want to be inclusive in terms of different type of approaches to remove carbon from the atmosphere, necessarily we need to leave some flexibility to the private sector that will implement or develop approaches that are quite specific. If I take the example of bio-CCS, we have one methodology for bio-CCS, but you have a lot of sub-activities in terms of bio-CCS. CO2 can come from a power plant, it can come from a fermentation process for production of ethanol, it can come from waste to energy plants, etc. And we need a robust quantification in all cases, but we cannot develop at the level of the Commission all the details of the MRV for each of these sub-activities, let's say. So that's why it's important to work in collaboration with the private sectors that are really implementing the very specific methodology. We put requirements, so they have to follow the requirements, but after they have a marge de maneuver, let's say, to be more specific in their own requirements.
Noah, if I can kind of ask you on the American side, as part of the purchase price in particular, do you want to explain kind of how are you seeing what role government should play when it comes to MRV of these different projects?
Yeah, it's a great question. So as we think about MRV for our own CDR purchases, what we're trying to do is really understand what the art of the possible looks like today and do two things. One is make sure that we have confidence in the lower bound of what we're getting. We want to know that we're at least getting some directional carbon removal and give folks credit for that. And then invest in innovation and figure out how to, over time, have greater confidence that we're having more of the full impact. Basically, we're trying to be as conservative as we need to be to avoid over-crediting, but not stop the field from innovating early on. And so we see two parallel technology innovations that need to happen. One is that kind of deployment-led innovation that we've seen happen with solar, wind, other types of clean energy technologies. That's more on the technology side for many of these solutions. What we're trying to do on the MMRV side is figure out how do we develop the sensors, the models, all of the tools that we're going to need to bring down those costs over time. And it's a very different innovation problem. It has many higher fixed costs. Some of it isn't physical innovation, but software innovation to figure out how to actually do that modeling in a more robust way over time. And much of that innovation is we need to inform it through new science. And so it's really an important and in many ways expensive early effort that we think can radically drive down the cost of the credits associated with these projects as that technology gets better and better over time. And so our approach is really don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. We want to get to perfect over time, but we don't need it to have confidence that we can move forward at small scale and innovate now. And we hope that that approach is adopted by others. And we recognize that that's going to involve a higher cost in terms of the overall credits, because we're effectively under crediting what we think the credits will look like in the long term. But we think that that's the right conservative approach to take. And at small and growing scales, it's one where we think that over time, the undercrediting can be reduced as we have greater confidence in the MRV, and those costs can come down both on the technology and the MRV side.
And what I'm going to do now, thank you, Noah. We're going to start weaving in also some questions from the audience. And actually after we've heard Fabien and Noah, I'd love to, Radhika, move to you and actually ask you, we've just heard from, two government representatives. Should we trust them on their plans? Because, and what came from the audience as well is there have been a lot of issues with the voluntary carbon market, right? And in the past, governments have failed to potentially put in place the right regulation to prevent some of the things that have happened, especially, I guess, around the avoidance market. And so what do you think about the removals market in this? Should we trust governments? And yeah, as an NGO, I think you're best placed to address this.
Thank you. It's a great question. And I do understand the concern, but at the same time, what is the alternative? Of course, we need to trust governments in this particular case. And I mean, the sector is so young that I wouldn't say that there has been necessarily a failure. It's just that at the end of the day, things do take time. And I do see a crucial role for governments, given now that we have so many different actors and so different standards and so many different protocols. And this is great in a lot of initiatives, but we truly need more oversight, and we need an entity to really create consistency and truly make sure that there is trust and we continue building this trust. And I do see in the case of the EU, truly the Commission coming up with this CRCF initiative and all the work around it. And I think the risk of not having the governments play this role is potentially even bigger, because at the end of the day, we are developing a lot of policies that deal with CDR, and it could be at some point, if we don't get MRV to have to be consistent and trusted, then the issues around MRV could spill over into policy as well, and that's even a bigger risk from my perspective. And lastly, I would say that governments also have a crucial role in fostering this trust that we need, also by aligning national carbon counting methods with global standards, and to mitigate potential issues at global level around double counting and so on. So that's a long answer to say yes, we need to trust governments.
I think I would just add one thing there, is that it's not just trusting governments to fix or regulate the voluntary carbon market. We already trust government to do a lot of quality infrastructure work. Like, so much of our society is sort of underpinned by, there's a regulation about bridges and the concrete that goes into bridges, and when you check if the bridge is okay. Granted, there's a lot of issues around infrastructure, and we can talk about those offline, but we already trust governments to do a lot of stuff that runs in the background. And I think aspects of carbon removal, MRV, and standardization and quality infrastructure will start to look like things like that. It won't be only a centralized body that has rules for carbon removal. It'll be all of this background, our national accreditation bodies and national standards bodies and national metrology institutes, all playing the role that they already play across industries. So yes, trust in government, but in both a centralized and very decentralized and distributed way. There's so many tools that we can leverage that government already has.
And I'm curious, like Noah and Fabien, is this the concerns around, I guess, the previous kind of VCM issues and potential lack in kind of government involvement and how that unfolded? Does that ever reach your desk? Is this something that kind of you think about, and not just within the CDR bubble, but I guess broader trust from the general public? And are there measures that you think governments can take to kind of foster that trust?
To me, it's a trust but verify, right? I don't think the trust just should be given, it should be earned. And that's one of the things that I think we need to do over time, is show that the projects that we create are high quality projects, have that transparency, show how we're very confident in the amount that we do credit, and over time work to increase that as we get greater and greater confidence. But I think that that trust needs to be earned back, not just granted from where we are today.
Sorry, I'm going to jump in here again on trust. As I've mentioned, I'm kind of obsessed with this trust thing. When we talk about trust in governments, I think it's also not just EU level or US Department of Energy level, sort of like federal top-down trust in government. There's actually a lot of challenges there, particularly when you start thinking about deploying projects in communities. And that's a whole other panel and days of conversation, but trust in government can exist at different levels, right? So trust in a federal agency can look different than trust in a state government, or trust in a local government where your neighbor is on the city council and they're thinking about climate and sustainability in that context. So I think as a CDR community, we can also think about trust that way, and we can think about the role of local governments and local projects in social demonstration and building understanding of and trust in CDR.
Yeah, and if you can add one thing, is I fully agree with Anu and Noah on that, and that's why at the level of the European Commission we need to be right from the very beginning, because as Anu said, there is different levels. There is first the level of the methodology, then you have the level of all the people that are going to do the verification. So they need to have an accreditation, etc. Then you have the level of the project developer, etc. And things can be wrong at all, can go wrong at all the levels. So we really need to pay a very specific attention to try to not introduce some element of lack of trust from the very beginning. And that's why in the development of the methodology, we also need to look very closely at what science is telling us, to have experts, to have academics looking at our methodology, and to put in place the methodology only when we have a certain amount of certainty of what we are doing, basically. Why I'm saying that is because, as you know, for the CSCF, we started with the methodology where we have more clarity. We started with the direct air capture and CCS. We started with bio CCS and things on biochar. And already things on biochar, because of open system, we have discussions that are not so easy. And people are asking, and it's very normal, I think, to look at all the solutions. And there are also solutions with huge potential, and we need to look at them. I'm thinking about enhanced rock weathering. I'm thinking about things with ocean. But on that, we want to propose something only when we have a certain level of certainty on what we are doing. And that's why we rely so much on people like Anu, on people like all the people that help us to understand what we are able to do today in terms of quantification on this methodology. Is so important for us that, I think it's a key element.
I think what you all touch on is this eternal tension in carbon removal between wanting to move fast, but also not wanting to break things, right? And kind of moving at just the right pace is almost impossible. So there will always be people on one side saying we need to move faster and maybe cut corners, and there will always be people on the other side saying it's moving too fast. And I think we're seeing that with the CSCF, but we're seeing it in so many areas. And yeah, so really interesting. One other kind of, I guess, area of questions and interest was around, maybe there's two aspects here, but maybe first around innovation in MRV. And I don't know if I can ask you maybe first to educate people on what are you seeing, like what are some of the innovations that you're seeing in the MRV space? And then I'd also maybe love to hear from you, but also potentially from others, how are governments going to adapt to these innovations and to this landscape that keeps changing when it comes to MRV? But yeah, Anu, over to you.
Yeah, so I think I'm seeing a lot of innovation, and we talked about this around the cost of MRV and reducing uncertainties in MRV. So there's a lot of work driven by the voluntary carbon market and suppliers who are in the space today around sensors and model development to drive down the cost of MRV while also increasing the rigor and reducing uncertainty. And I think governments can play a really big role in supporting that and already are supporting that in a number of ways. We've talked about sensor development. I think governments can play a really important role in supporting private and academic work on model development and also keeping that work out in the open where we can see it and we can inspect it. And so making sure that doesn't go fully into a proprietary black box. I think there's going to be innovation on data management and data use because these projects are going to be creating enormous amounts of data, some of which is needs to be visible to the public, some of which is more proprietary. And I think governments can help provide clarity around data standardization as well. And that's happened in other industries. And that data piece can take multiple forms. It can be data standardization. It can be directly hosting data. So for example, the national labs in the US host data for a number of different Earth system processes. It can also be supporting efforts like NSF-funded projects and nonprofits to host data. Yeah, there's a lot happening in MRV innovation, but I would say the crux of it is sensors and models to drive down cost, and government can play a supportive role there.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think what we have to figure out how to do is invest in that innovation as swiftly as we can, but know that that innovation is fundamentally iterative with deployment of solutions, that we can't actually calibrate models unless we have larger and larger samples of these efforts, but we can't get larger and larger samples of how things work without some sort of business model for those. And so I think it's how do we have a combination of government and private support and start from a frame of basically undercrediting so that we're confident that we're getting at least some, and over time increase that certainty, because I think this is fundamentally going to be something that we can't silo and think of MRV development and technology development. It's going to have to be a very iterative and recursive process.
Just to build on that point that Noah raised, I think one thing that governments can help support in, and I think folks in communities have already identified as a need, is technical assistance programs. So there's these new technologies, there are companies that are coming in that want to deploy them in different contexts. There are folks who live in those communities. There's farmers and ranchers and producers who might be engaging with open system CDR. And there is, I think, generally, and I've heard this directly from folks, a lack of technical assistance capacity available. So maybe there's a supply push or demand pull policy. Maybe there's a supplier that you could work with, but connecting those dots can be really challenging, absent sort of technical assistance infrastructure. And governments already have this kind of programming in other areas. So I think that's another place where government can support the deployment of both solutions and the MRV that goes alongside them.
Fabia, did you want to speak briefly about how within the CSCF, I guess, you can keep up to speed with innovation in MRV?
Yeah, and maybe we should go beyond the CSCF, because CSCF is really the process for the certification. And in Europe, we should mobilize maybe more instruments to also help and support the research in terms of MRV. Of course, I'm thinking about all the research funding that we have, Horizon Europe, the Innovation Fund. Well, Innovation Fund maybe is not the best instrument for that, but at least Horizon Europe, I think we need to use more calls from the Horizon Europe to develop research to help us to develop better sensors for carbon farming, for instance, for open system, as Anu was mentioned, but not only open system. I think there is also, when you look at the monitoring for industrial installation and detection of methane emissions or CO2 emissions from industrial installation, is also a promising sector and very important. We also need to find the right instrument to promote not only the pure academic research, but also to put in place demonstration activities of certain type of for certain type of activities. I'm thinking about the LIFE project in Europe. Also, we have a LIFE project that is oriented very much towards environment and climate policies, and a project bringing solutions to improve this kind of, to support activities that are doing something benefit on this. And this LIFE project could be also, we have in mind few projects that are really doing that. They are demonstrating that they're used to demonstrate some innovative pathways in terms of carbon farming and in terms of measuring and reporting what is really happening at the level of the farm, for instance, in terms of fluxes of CO2. So we need to think beyond the CSCF and to use all these frameworks to do all the work that we need to do in terms of research and innovation. And when it's ready, that the measurement is done correctly, that this is scalable, etc., we can introduce them in the context of the CSCF.
Thank you, Fabien. And in the minute that we have left, I would like the kind of three things that really stood out to me from this conversation was that, CDR is not just tech, it's a product, and the product includes MRV. And I think we spoke quite a lot about what that MRV has to look like. I really like the discussion around innovation in MRV and why that's so important. It makes it more robust, more trustworthy, it reduces costs, but government has to also contribute to that innovation, right? And then I also really like the point about trust has to be earned, right? And that essentially for this to work, the government has to foster the development of this industry in the right way. At this point, maybe can we quickly share the final slide? And that's at this point, I would like to thank the speakers. I saw that Noah had to drop off already, but thank you very much, Anu, Fabien, and Rodika for joining us today. Subscribe here to get notified about the next webinar that we might host at Carbonfuture. I'm sure it's not going to be a long time from now. And also make sure to sign up to our newsletter. And with that, thank you everyone for this really engaging discussions around digital infrastructure and digital MRV and policy. And yeah, thank you for your time, both participants and speakers. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.